Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and he solved Death's Silent Prayer, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. Confession Came Too Late, Father. The man's voice trembled through the confessional grate. "Forgive me, Father, for I have killed a man who died before I could." Father Brown froze. The candlelight flickered once, as if even the flame refused to listen further. Outside, the rain struck the stained glass windows of St. Agnes Church like a warning. The wind carried a howl that seemed too human, too close. In all his years of hearing the worst humanity had to offer, the lies disguised as truth, the truths disguised as mercy, he had never heard a confession like this. The man continued, voice cracking under the weight of something far heavier than guilt. "He was already dead when I found him. But I swear to you, Father, I still killed him." Father Brown's hand, steady even in the face of murder, faltered slightly over the cross. There was a smell in the air, not of incense or candle wax, but of rusted iron. The scent of blood never truly leaves a man who's seen it before. "What do you mean, my son?" Father Brown asked softly. The man didn't answer. Only the sound of dripping echoed between them, slow, deliberate, like time itself, bleeding out. Then came the whisper, "He deserved to die twice." By the time Father Brown opened the confessional door, the booth was empty. Only the small envelope remained on the bench. Inside it was a photograph, sepia-toned, old, and creased at the edges. It showed a grave. No name, just a date. Tomorrow. He looked up sharply. The clock struck midnight. The next morning, the churchyard was alive with whispers. A man had been found dead at the edge of the cemetery, lying face down in the mud before an unmarked grave. The same one from the photograph. No identification, no witnesses. Only a rosary clenched in his hand and a scrap of torn cloth with the faint outline of a confessional grill burned into it. The inspector arrived later, smelling of rain and impatience. "You knew him?" he asked. Father Brown only looked at the photograph again. "Not yet," he said. "But he came to confess last night." The inspector frowned. "And you didn't see his face?" "Not in this life," Father Brown murmured. What troubled him wasn't the confession, it was the timing. The man said he killed someone who was already dead. And yet, by dawn, he was the one found lifeless. If guilt was the cause of death, Father Brown had just heard the dead confess to their own murder. He walked through the church after dusk, candles trembling with each breath of the storm. There was something unnatural about the silence. The choir loft creaked, though no one stood there. The organ let out a faint hum, as though it remembered a hymn that hadn't been played in years. And somewhere behind him, a door clicked shut. Father Brown turned. No one. Only a trail of wet footprints leading from the confessional toward the nave, and stopping abruptly beneath the statue of St. Dymphna, the patron saint of the insane. On the floor beneath her marble gaze, another envelope. This one sealed with black wax. Inside, a single page. "You heard me, Father, but you didn't stop me." The ink was still damp. That night, Father Brown didn't sleep. He sat in the rectory, staring at the rain-slicked windows, the photograph, the letters, the rosary. Every clue forming a pattern too painful to name. He had the dreadful sense that this was not a murder of flesh, but of time itself. Someone had killed something that had already died. Faith, love, or perhaps truth. He returned to the confessional at dawn. The air was cold, and the scent of wax was heavy. Something glimmered on the wood. He leaned closer. Blood. A small streak, as though a hand had pressed against it from the inside. He knelt and whispered a prayer. When he looked up again, he noticed something carved faintly into the wood, so faint it could only be seen in morning light. He confessed before he died. But that made no sense. The inspector's report said the man's body was found around 11 before midnight, the same time Father Brown heard the confession. So who had spoken to him? Father Brown walked into the churchyard as dawn broke. Mist rolled low over the graves, like restless souls waiting for recognition. The unmarked grave from the photograph stood open now, a shovel driven into the earth beside it. Inside lay not one coffin, but two. One ancient and decayed, the other freshly nailed shut. The second coffin had no name, only a single word scratched into the wood. Mine. Father Brown felt a chill so deep it reached the marrow. Whoever had come to confess hadn't done so for forgiveness. They had come to leave something behind. He turned as the bell of St. Agnes tolled 6 times, but he wasn't alone. A figure stood near the edge of the churchyard, still almost spectral, wearing the same torn cloth from the dead man's hand. The face was shadowed, but the stance was unmistakable. Someone who had waited too long to repent. "Do you believe in unfinished sins, Father?" the figure asked quietly. Before he could reply, lightning split the sky, and the figure vanished. Only the echo of the voice remained, threading through the graves like smoke. Back inside, Father Brown examined the coffin again. The nails were rusted, yet freshly driven. Someone had sealed it during the night. When he tried to lift the lid, the metal bent back like something inside had pushed against it from within. He stepped back, heart heavy, mind racing. 2 coffins, 1 soul. He could feel the edges of something vast and terrible. A confession that crossed the boundary between the living and the dead. Someone had killed to atone, not for their own sin, but for another's. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement near the altar. The candle flame flared higher than before, too high, stretching toward the crucifix like it was reaching for something unseen. Father Brown whispered, "Show me, Lord." A gust of wind swept through the chapel, snuffing every candle except one, the one near the confessional. Its flame burned blue. He approached it. The confessional door was open now. Inside, a single rosary hung from the grill. But this time, it wasn't empty. Someone had carved words into the seat itself, jagged and uneven, as if written in desperation. "You should have listened sooner." Father Brown closed his eyes. The pieces were aligning, but every answer birthed another question. Who had come first, the sinner or the sin? He found himself remembering the voice from last night. "He was already dead when I found him." What if that wasn't metaphorical? What if the man who confessed had found his own body? By the time the inspector returned that evening, the grave was filled in again. "We've confirmed the body's identity," the inspector said grimly. "Name's Thomas Calloway. Died 20 years ago. Shot himself right outside this church." Father Brown's breath caught. "Then who," he began softly, "who came to confession last night?" The inspector frowned. "That's impossible, Father. Thomas Calloway's been buried under that tree since 1902. A silence followed, so deep it seemed to absorb the sound of the rain itself. That night, Father Brown sat before the confessional, waiting. He knew the pattern now: midnight, rain, candlelight, a voice that didn't belong to the living. And right on time, it came again. "Forgive me, Father, for I have killed." Father Brown's pulse stilled. "You've come back." "No," the voice said. "You've never left." The candle blew out. What happened next would be spoken of only in whispers. The morning congregation found the confessional door ajar, the rosary missing, and the words, "Let him rest," etched into the inside wall. Father Brown stood at the altar, face pale, eyes distant, as though he had seen something too heavy for language. When the inspector asked what he'd discovered, Father Brown simply said, "The living and the dead both seek confession, Inspector, but not all souls want absolution." He walked toward the open graveyard, the mist curling around his feet, the bell tolling in the distance. The photograph, now faded, slipped from his sleeve. It showed the grave again. The date had changed. Yesterday. And as the wind carried the faint echo of that same trembling voice, he deserved to die twice. Father Brown stopped at the church gate, turned slightly, and whispered to no one, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." The candle at the altar flared once more, then died, leaving only the sound of rain tapping softly against the stained glass, like a heartbeat too faint to be real. And for the first time in his life, Father Brown wasn't sure whether the confession had come too late or too soon. Chapter 2. Father Brown finds missing soul. They buried the wrong body. That was the first thing Father Brown was told when he arrived at the cemetery before dawn, his cassock soaked in fog and rain. The gravedigger's hands trembled as he pointed to the half-open coffin. Inside lay a corpse, dressed in a priest's robe, but the face was not his. The rosary clasped between the cold fingers was engraved with Father Brown's own initials. At first he thought it was a cruel prank, the sort of joke the devil might play on a tired man of faith. But as the first light of morning crept through the mist, he realized the truth was far worse. The man in the coffin was not only unknown to him, it was someone who had died confessing his name. "Father Brown," whispered the sexton, his voice breaking. "He was found outside the rectory gate last night. Said he'd lost his soul. Said he'd come to return yours." The air hung heavy. The rain fell silent. Somewhere, a crow shrieked from the church steeple. Father Brown stared at the body for a long moment, his reflection wavering on the wet surface of the coffin lid. The man's face was pale, lips slightly parted, as if mid-confession. His throat bore a faint red mark, a rosary burn perhaps, but his eyes were what unsettled Father Brown most. Open, glassy, and fixed on the church door, as if he'd died looking for forgiveness that never came. "I've seen many dead men," Father Brown murmured, "but never one that looked like he still had something left to say." Inside the church, candles flickered violently. The confessional booth, his sanctuary, was ajar. He approached it slowly, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing down on his chest. The seat was warm. The scent of candle wax mingled with something metallic. Blood? No, older. Something that belonged to memory. A single sheet of paper rested where a sinner might kneel. It was written in an unsteady hand, "The soul you lost is not yours anymore." Father Brown felt the paper tremble between his fingers. The ink wasn't dry. Someone had left it moments before, but who? He stepped outside again, scanning the fog-veiled cemetery. The graves looked different somehow, older, as if time had folded back on itself. On one of the headstones, he noticed something carved crudely into the stone, cutting across the original name, Father Brown. He leaned closer. Beneath his name, the date of death. Last night. He froze. The world felt distant, muffled, like a dream teetering on the edge of waking. This is madness, he whispered to himself. Or a message. When he returned to the rectory, everything inside was exactly as he had left it, except for one thing. The mirror above the fireplace was cracked straight down the middle. In the reflection, Father Brown swore he saw movement behind him. A man in a black coat, face shadowed, holding a rosary that dripped red. He turned. Nothing. Only silence and the faint scent of incense. But the mirror didn't lie. In its fractured reflection, he saw it again. His own figure standing beside the coffin, though he was here, alive, breathing. He pressed his palm against the glass. It was ice cold. The crack widened with a soft sound, like a sigh. That night, the dreams came. He saw the dead man again, walking through the church aisle, eyes empty, mouthing words without sound. The organ played, though no one touched it. The congregation turned as one, faces melting into shadow. Then the dead man lifted his rosary and pointed at Father Brown. When he woke, the rosary from the corpse was lying on his chest. The next day, the inspector arrived. Same as always, with too much cynicism and too little faith. "Another strange business, Father," he said. "We've checked the morgue records. The man's fingerprints don't exist. No parishioner recognized him. And yet—" He hesitated, producing an envelope sealed with wax. "This was found in his pocket, addressed to you." Father Brown opened it. Inside was a torn photograph. Half of it showed the church, the other half missing. The edge was burned. On the back, a single phrase, written in Latin, "Non omnis moriar." Not all of me shall die. That night, Father Brown walked alone through the village, his lantern swaying in the mist. The cobblestones were slick, the air thick with damp secrets. Every step echoed with something that didn't belong to him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, not by footsteps, but by his own shadow, slightly out of rhythm, as though it had a will of its own. When he reached the churchyard, the coffin was gone. In its place lay a pile of dirt, freshly disturbed. A shovel leaned nearby. The grave had been filled again, but not properly. Something beneath the soil moved, slow and deliberate, like breath beneath a shroud. He knelt, touched the dirt, and whispered a prayer. The ground pulsed, once, then stillness. He should have turned back then. But curiosity, that dangerous cousin of faith, urged him forward. He dug with his hands until his fingers struck wood. When he pried it open, the coffin was empty. Only the rosary remained, this time broken clean in half. From the trees came a voice, low, calm, and wrong. "You shouldn't have found him, Father." He stood slowly. "Who's there?" A silhouette stepped forward, tall, wrapped in a coat too fine for the mud it trailed. The face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but the voice was unmistakably human, and yet not. "He was looking for his soul," the stranger said, "but you took it first." Father Brown felt something stir in his chest, an ache he hadn't known since his earliest days as a priest. "That's not possible." "Everything lost must belong to someone," the voice replied, "even a soul." The figure vanished as the church bell tolled midnight. When Father Brown returned inside, the candles had burned to their bases. The confessional door stood open again. A whisper floated from within. He recognized it instantly. The same voice that had spoken last night. The same voice that had confessed murder before vanishing into thin air. "Father," it breathed, "I found him." He stepped inside the booth, trembling. "Who are you?" he asked. No answer. Only the sound of rosary beads clicking together, one by one, until they stopped. He reached out, and his hand touched something wet. When he drew it back, the tips of his fingers were dark with blood. He leaned closer to the grill. On the other side, carved deep into the wood, were 3 words: "You are forgiven." But whose voice had said it? By dawn, the inspector returned with grim news. "You might want to sit down, Father," he said, removing his hat. "We checked the morgue again. The body you saw yesterday, it's gone." "Gone?" Father Brown echoed. "Vanished. And here's the strange thing. The grave's been refilled, but there are 2 sets of footprints, one leading to the church, one leaving. Same size, same shape, same shoes." The priest's eyes flicked toward the window, where the mist still clung to the glass like breath. "Perhaps he came back for his confession," he said quietly. The inspector scoffed. "You mean the dead man?" Father Brown didn't answer. He only looked down at his hands, where a small cut bled along his palm, the same hand that had touched the coffin. That night, something compelled him to visit the cemetery once more. He couldn't explain it, only that a voice inside him whispered that someone was waiting. The fog was so thick now he could barely see his own lantern glow. He reached the grave. The ground was disturbed again. Something small gleamed in the dirt. Metal. He picked it up. It was half of a rosary bead, cracked through the center. The break was clean, unnatural. As he turned it in his hand, he realized it wasn't made of wood at all. It was bone. His lantern flickered. The fog swirled. He heard footsteps, his own, and another pair behind him, perfectly synchronized. When he stopped, so did they. When he moved again, so did they. "Show yourself," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The air thickened. Out of the mist, the same figure appeared again, hat low, coat dripping. The same shadow that didn't belong to any man of this world. "You shouldn't have looked for him," it said. "Now he'll look for you." Lightning cracked the sky, and the figure was gone. In its place, a small wooden box sat atop the grave. Inside, a note written in the same hand as before. "A soul cannot be found until another is lost." Father Brown's breath caught. He looked around. The fog pulsed like something alive. His lantern extinguished itself, and in the dark, he heard the faint sound of someone praying. His own voice. He fell to his knees, gripping the cross around his neck. "Lord," he whispered, "what have I lost?" The wind answered him by name. By the following morning, the village was in uproar. The bell of St. Agnes rang on its own before sunrise. The inspector burst into the rectory with a look of disbelief. "Father, you'd better come," he said. "We found another body, same grave, same clothes, but this time—" He stopped, visibly shaken. "This time, it looks like you." Father Brown walked to the site in silence. When he saw it, he didn't speak for a long while. The corpse was dressed in his cassock, his collar, his shoes. The face, identical. Except the eyes. His own were calm. Theirs, empty, blackened, staring at heaven as if seeing nothing at all. "Is this a warning?" asked the inspector. Father Brown touched the corpse's rosary. "No," he murmured. "It's a replacement." The inspector frowned. Replacement for what? But Father Brown didn't answer. That night, alone in his study, he compared the 2 halves of the rosary, the broken one from the grave and the intact one he wore. When he aligned them, they fit perfectly, forming a seamless circle. And when he did, The candle flame in the room stretched long, bending toward the confessional as if drawn by invisible breath. He followed it, heart pounding. Inside the booth, the seat was occupied. The dead man, his mirror, sat slumped forward, rosary in hand. Father Brown reached out, trembling. The figure's lips moved. "I found it," it whispered. "Your missing soul." And then the figure collapsed into dust. When dawn came, the inspector found Father Brown kneeling before the altar, alive but silent. In his hands, he held the complete rosary, its beads faintly warm. "Are you all right?" the inspector asked. Father Brown looked up, eyes distant. "A man's soul can wander," he said softly. "Sometimes it finds its way home. Sometimes it takes someone else's place to do so." The inspector hesitated. So, was he real? Father Brown smiled faintly, though his eyes glistened like someone carrying too much knowledge. "We are all real," he said, "until someone prays us away." The bell rang once, though no hand pulled its rope. Father Brown turned toward the sound. His shadow on the wall stretched longer than it should have, two figures where there should have been one. And as he whispered a final prayer, that second shadow smiled. No one ever saw the body again. But every morning after, villagers swore they saw Father Brown standing by the cemetery gates before dawn, still, silent, head bowed in prayer. And when asked about the missing soul, he would only say, "I found it, but it wasn't mine to keep." The candle, by his side, never went out again. Chapter 3. A Whisper. Only he heard they found her body hanging above the altar, but only Father Brown heard her speak. The words came from the boy who rang the bell that morning, pale-faced and trembling. His voice cracked as he explained how he'd walked into the chapel, same as every morning, only to find the body of Evelyn Hargrave suspended by a crimson ribbon from the rafters, her eyes wide open, staring down as if pleading for something no one could hear. No one but Father Brown. She had disappeared 3 days ago. No ransom, no note, no signs of struggle. Just a locked bedroom door, a half-finished diary entry, and a church bell that wouldn't stop ringing long after midnight. People thought she had run away, or worse, left of her own accord. But there she was, swaying above the altar like some ghastly offering, wearing the same white dress she'd worn at confirmation. When the police arrived, they sealed the church. The coroner called it suicide. But Father Brown stood at the threshold, silent. He had heard her, not in the way a man hears the rustle of leaves or the toll of bells, but in the breath between prayers, in the soundless gasp of candles extinguishing themselves, in the strange echo of her name whispered through the stone archways. "Father," she had said, not in words, but in a presence so heavy he'd nearly fallen to his knees. "I didn't climb, I was lifted." No one believed him. The inspector dismissed it as grief, exhaustion, religious delirium. But Father Brown knew the difference between madness and truth. And this wasn't madness. This was murder. That night, he returned to the locked chapel. The police had left. The body was taken. The altar scrubbed clean. But the air was wrong. The pews were colder than stone. The candle flames flickered away from the crucifix as if afraid. He sat alone, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the spot where Evelyn's body had hung. There, in the wood grain of the rafter, something remained, a single red thread. When he touched it, he heard it again, her whisper, "Find my voice." The next day, he read her diary. Most of it was ordinary, lists, prayers, little complaints about school. But the final page was torn in half. The sentence, unfinished. "I saw him again today. The man in the..." And nothing more. He searched her room. Behind the mirror, taped to the frame, he found a photograph. A group of children standing before the church 10 years ago. One face was scratched out violently, not burned, scratched, over and over, until only the hollow shape remained. Father Brown brought the photograph to the inspector. "Who's this?" he asked. The inspector frowned. "It's just a school photo. Evelyn would have been 6. But that face?" He hesitated. "I think that was George Halley, the choir master. Died in a fire 7 years ago. Accidental, they said." Father Brown shook his head. "No, he didn't die in the fire. His body was never found. That night, he didn't sleep." The whisper returned, clearer now. It came from the walls, from the confessional, from the pipe organ's broken keys. She followed the hymn. The next morning, he searched the chapel's sheet music. One folder sat out of place, misfiled under Advent, though it belonged to Lent. The hymn, "Abide with Me." He sat at the organ, played the melody, and beneath the soft notes a second sound emerged, a groan. He paused, listened. It came again, from below, the crypt. He descended the narrow stairwell, lantern held high. The air was thick, metallic. He hadn't been down here in years. The walls still bore soot from the fire that had supposedly taken George Halley's life. As he reached the bottom step, the light flickered, and he heard it again. A voice. But not Evelyn's this time. Why did she remember me? He spun around. No one. Only shadows. In the corner of the crypt, behind a half-collapsed stone, he found something buried in the dust. A box. Inside, bones. Small. Burned. Not a full body, only fragments. Alongside them, a crucifix engraved with initials, G.H., and a lock of hair, tied in a red ribbon. Evelyn's hair. He clutched the crucifix, knuckles white. "What happened to her?" he asked aloud. But the crypt gave no answer. When he emerged, dawn was breaking. The sky was sickly grey. At Mass, he could barely focus. Every time the bell rang, he flinched. Every time a candle flickered, he looked behind him. Then, during the final hymn, the whisper came again. In the vestry, he stood mid-sermon and walked. The congregation watched, confused. He entered the vestry and found the old confessional curtain swaying, though there was no wind. He stepped behind it. There, scrawled on the inside wall in faint charcoal, "He still walks among them." That night, Father Brown searched parish records. George Halley was presumed dead at 32, but a recent donation to the church bore the name Gregory Hale. Same initials, same handwriting in the donation ledger. A false name, a new life. He was here, still in the village, still watching. The next clue came from an old woman, Agnes Mallory, nearly blind, but sharp as a blade. She remembered George well, remembered his voice. "He always hummed," she said. "Couldn't help it, even when he spoke." Father Brown went cold. So did the new janitor. Young, kind-faced, always polite, but always humming. The same tune. "Abide with me." He confronted him the next day. "Do you know the hymn?" The man smiled. "Of course, Father. It's my favorite." "Why?" The man paused, then said, "It was playing the night I was saved." Father Brown stared into his eyes, and in that moment, he knew. Not everything that burns is destroyed. He watched him leave the chapel, whistling the same tune, dusting off pews with the same hands that once lifted a child to her death. He couldn't prove it. Not yet. No fingerprints, no footage. Just a whisper. Just a voice no one else had heard. And that made it worse, because it meant the soul crying out for justice had chosen only him. He returned to the altar where Evelyn had hung, laid the ribbon gently on the stone. "She remembers you," he said to the empty air, and so do I. A gust of wind blew out the candles. Only one remained, flickering, dim, but alive. And in that flame, for the briefest second, he saw her face, eyes closed, at peace, then gone. The next morning, the janitor didn't show up. He never came back. And when Father Brown entered the chapel, he found the final message written in ash across the altar cloth. She whispered to the right one. He folded the cloth, held it to his chest, and whispered back. I heard her. The truth was clear now, but it would never be proven. And as he turned away from the altar, one question remained. Why had Evelyn chosen him to hear her final breath? And what had she really wanted him to do with it? He never told the inspector. He simply said, "The soul she spoke through has been answered." And when asked, "Who did it?" Father Brown replied, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Because some whispers aren't meant to be heard, some are meant to haunt, and some are meant to guide." Chapter 4. Buried Clue. Beneath church floor. They found a human tooth lodged beneath the altar stone, fresh, bloodied, and still warm. It was the kind of thing that didn't make sense, not in the cold stone silence of St. Jude's Chapel, the kind of thing that should never have been discovered, let alone pulsing with the faint echo of life. Yet there it was, glinting under the thin beam of the sacristan's lantern. Like a secret, the earth had grown tired of hiding. Father Brown said nothing at first. He only stared. The altar had stood untouched for over 2 centuries. No renovations, no restorations, no reason to disturb the foundation. But that morning, when the candles wouldn't light and the crucifix above the altar inexplicably fell during matins, something told him the ground beneath was not as holy as they believed. And now this, a tooth, lodged in centuries-old stone. The inspector arrived before noon, muttering about pranksters or rodents, or maybe a parishioner with too much imagination and too little sleep. But Father Brown wasn't swayed by the familiar dance of reason. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. He waited until nightfall before returning. Alone. The chapel creaked under the weight of its own silence. Candles refused to burn properly, their flames twitching violently as if reacting to something unseen. He knelt before the altar, fingertips pressed to the smooth marble, and he heard it, a sound, so faint it could have been memory, a scraping, like bone dragged across stone. Then, a whisper, a single word, not in Latin, not in prayer, just a name. Maria. He stood quickly, heart pounding. The name meant nothing to him, not yet, but his instincts, honed over decades of listening to sins and lies alike, told him the church floor had not finished speaking. The next day, he requested the parish archives. The records were brittle and incomplete, most eaten by mold or lost to careless hands. But in one yellowed ledger, beneath baptisms and marriages, was a brief notation, dated 1897. Burial denied, Maria Voss. Grounds, excommunication. Reclaimed by family under protest. Body not placed in consecrated ground. No burial location listed. No records of a grave. But that was the year the altar was reinforced. Father Brown paced the nave, lips moving in silent calculation. If someone had been buried beneath the chapel illegally, they would have needed time, privacy, and a reason. But more than that, they would have needed protection. A church floor is not easily disturbed, and yet something had been placed there and left to decay in silence. He returned to the altar at dusk, this time with tools. He waited until the bell tolled midnight, then lifted the worn rug at its base and began tapping along the edge of the stone where the tooth had been found. hollow. He pressed harder. The tile cracked, then shifted. Beneath it, not earth, but wood. Rotten, splintered, blood-stained. He tore through it with bare hands until he uncovered what could only be a sealed box. No larger than a coffin, but misshapen, as if the body inside had not rested quietly. He hesitated, prayed, then opened it. The smell hit first, not just death, but something older, angrier. Inside were bones, too small for a grown woman, a rosary tangled through the ribcage, scraps of linen, once white, now black with time, and clutched in the skeleton's hand. A locket, still intact. Inside the locket, two faces, a priest and a girl. Father Brown stared in disbelief. He knew the man. The photograph was over 100 years old, yet he recognized the eyes instantly. Father Benedict, his predecessor, respected, loved, venerated. But the girl, Maria Voss, was no longer a mystery. She had been buried beneath the church floor by the very man who had led the flock for 30 years, and no one had known, except now, someone did. The next morning, Father Brown stood before the congregation, voice steady, but every word weighed down by the secret he carried. The chapel felt smaller, the air heavier. The altar, once the heart of holy ritual, now felt like a tomb. After the service, he confronted the oldest living parishioner, Mrs. Whitlow, 93, sharp as ever. She had served the church since before he was born. He showed her the locket. Her face went pale. "That's impossible," she whispered. "That's Father Benedict. And the girl. They said she was his niece." "They lied," Father Brown said softly. Mrs. Whitlow trembled. No one dared question him. He was the voice of God in this village. "But God," Father Brown replied, "doesn't bury children beneath the altar." That night, someone broke into the church. No valuables were taken, but the box was gone, vanished, the tiles replaced, as if nothing had ever been disturbed. Only one thing remained, the tooth, left neatly on the pulpit, wrapped in the altar cloth. A message. Father Brown didn't sleep. He sat in the vestry, locket in hand, praying not for answers, but for the strength to face the ones he already feared. He visited the diocesan archives in the city. Records were sparse, but one letter survived. A complaint from Maria Voss's mother, written in desperation. "He promised salvation. He promised love. But when my daughter swelled with his sin, he called her wicked and sent her into the ground." The letter was never answered. Back at the chapel, the atmosphere had changed. Parishioners began reporting strange things. Candles snuffing themselves. The sound of weeping behind the confessional curtain. A girl's voice, humming beneath the floorboards. The whispers were growing stronger. One night, Father Brown returned to find the crucifix above the altar turned upside down. Beneath it, carved into the stone with something jagged, "Tell the truth, or I will." He knew what must be done, but truth, in its rawest form, is a dangerous sermon. He held Mass that Sunday with trembling hands. As he approached the homily, he stared at the crucifix, now restored, yet feeling heavier than ever. "I speak today not of salvation," he began, "but of silence, the kind that kills, the kind that buries truth beneath holy ground." The congregation shifted, eyes narrowed. The whisper moved again, a breeze that touched no window. He opened the locket, held it up. This girl was buried beneath this very floor, not with prayer, but with shame, not by God's will, but by man's guilt. Gasps. Someone stood, others whispered. The man who did this wore this collar, spoke these words, held this Bible. He placed the locket on the altar, and that's when the bell tolled. Not once, but 13 times. The crowd froze. It had never done that before. Later, the inspector pulled him aside. "Why now, Father? Why speak after all these years?" Father Brown didn't look at him. He looked at the floor. "She asked me to." The inspector frowned. "She's been dead a century." She never stopped whispering. That night, he returned once more to the altar, laid the tooth beside the locket, prayed, and then he heard her again. But this time, not a whisper, a word, clear, echoing through every stone. Free. The candles burned brighter than ever. But just as he turned to leave, he noticed something. A second locket, on the altar, and inside it, his own photograph, next to hers. The flame extinguished itself, and in the darkness, she whispered once more, "You know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 5. Murder hid behind holy words. The priest confessed to murder, but the body that proved it was still alive. Those were the first words Father Brown heard before the morning bell stopped halfway through its chime. The sound died in the cold air, leaving the village silent in a way that felt wrong, like the hush that follows a scream. The message had been left under his door, scribbled in ink that looked too dark to be ink at all. There was no name, no sender, just those impossible words. He read them twice, then once more by the flickering light of his candle. The handwriting trembled as though written in pain. Whoever had sent it had either gone mad or found something so terrible they no longer cared for sanity. By the time the sun rose over Kembleford, the parishioners were whispering about Father Hale, the visiting cleric who'd been preaching the week's revival sermons. He had arrived a month ago, charming, eloquent, his voice a balm to the broken. People filled the pews again because of him. But now his chambers were locked, and no one had seen him since Vespers, the night before. When the inspector arrived, he looked grim. "They found something strange, Father," he said quietly. "A confession, signed by Hale himself, says he killed a man." Father Brown's brow furrowed. "And the body?" The inspector hesitated. "That's the trouble. The man he claimed to have killed came to morning mass." The world tilted for a moment. Father Brown felt a chill deeper than winter settle in his bones. "Alive?" The inspector nodded. "Quite. But the confession was real. Hale's signature, Hale's seal, even his blood pressed into the paper. He swore before God that he'd killed a man who now walks among us." And that was when the unease began to grow. Because in all his years, Father Brown had never seen a lie born from holiness so perfect that even truth itself seemed false. By afternoon, the whole village was whispering. Some said Hale had gone mad. Others said he'd seen an angel or a devil that convinced him of his own guilt. But Father Brown saw the pattern before anyone else. He had heard Hale's sermons, sermons that were too careful, too deliberate, always circling the same themes: sin disguised as grace, the evil that hides within the sacred. Every word had felt like a warning. That evening, Father Brown walked into the chapel, alone. Hale's Bible still rested open on the lectern, its margins filled with strange annotations, Latin phrases overwritten, ink scratched out, verses marked not with crosses, but with circles. One stood out: "The wages of sin is silence." And beneath it, in smaller, desperate handwriting, "He is not dead, but he should be." The candlelight wavered, catching on something wet at the corner of the Bible. Blood, fresh. He turned toward the altar. The scent of iron filled the air. Hale's clerical collar lay there, folded neatly, as if awaiting its owner's return. Something moved behind the confessional curtain. Father Brown stepped closer. every sense sharpening. The curtains swayed faintly. The booth was empty, except for a single white envelope on the seat, marked with one word: listen. Inside was a small wax cylinder, a phonograph recording. When he played it later that night, the crackle of static gave way to a voice that made his skin crawl. It was Hale's voice, calm, confessional. I saw him again, the man I killed. He came to me in daylight, wearing the same coat, speaking the same words. I buried him with my own hands. I heard the earth take him, but he looked at me tonight, alive as the Lord himself. Tell me, Father, what sin is this? What curse have I written in his name? The recording ended abruptly with a low hum, a breath, or perhaps a second voice whispering just beneath the surface, too faint to make out. Father Brown rewound it, listened again, and again. That second voice. It wasn't echo, it was answering. Someone else had been in the room when Hale recorded it. By morning, the chapel was sealed. The inspector had found no trace of Hale, no footprints, no trail. Just his bloodied collar and that haunting confession. But the man he claimed to have killed, James Merrow, the groundskeeper, was very much alive, pruning the rose bushes outside, his hands trembling every time the bell rang. Father Brown watched him quietly. There was something wrong about Merrow's movements, a stiffness, a detachment that didn't belong to the living. When he spoke, his words came too slow, as if spoken through borrowed lungs. "Did you know Father Hale well?" Father Brown asked. Merrow looked up with pale eyes. "Well enough to bury him," he said. For the first time in his life, Father Brown didn't know if he was standing before a man or a ghost. That night, he couldn't sleep. The recording replayed in his mind, the tremor in Hale's voice, the faint whisper beneath it. He began to wonder, what if Hale hadn't killed Merrow's body? What if he had killed something else? Something unseen? The next morning, when the church bell rang for Mass, the sound was wrong, lower, slower, as though the weight of it was dragging the whole building down. And when Father Brown entered the chapel, he saw the inscription, freshly carved into the wooden pulpit. "The living may lie, but the dead remember." It hadn't been there the night before. The congregation found him staring at it in silence. He delivered the sermon anyway, though his voice felt hollow. Hale's words lingered in his mind, weaving through every verse of Scripture. Halfway through the service, the door at the back of the church creaked open. Father Hale stood there, alive, pale, eyes hollow as candle smoke. The congregation gasped. Some crossed themselves, others whispered prayers. He walked down the aisle without speaking, his steps uneven, his hands trembling. He stopped before the altar, turned toward Father Brown, and spoke the words that would haunt the village for decades. "I have come to absolve myself." Then he collapsed. When they lifted him, he was dead. No wound, no struggle. Just gone, as if death had waited politely for his last word. The inspector called it heart failure. The villagers called it divine punishment. But Father Brown, standing over the body, felt something colder. In Hale's hand was another page torn from his Bible. Written across it in shaking ink were 5 words: "The murderer stands before God." And beneath that, faint but legible, "He's still preaching." That night, Father Brown stayed alone in the church. The inspector had ordered it locked, but he had the keys. He needed to understand, needed to hear what Hale had heard. At midnight, he stood at the pulpit, holding the blood-stained Bible. Read the last sermon Hale had written, words that made his throat tighten. "Beware those who preach salvation, for they may hide their sins in your prayers." The air shifted. A breeze that came from nowhere fluttered the pages. The candles burned higher. And then the whisper returned. The same voice from the recording. This time it was clear. "You're reading my words now, Father." He froze. "Hail." "No," the whisper breathed. "The one he killed." The pulpit shook. A crack split the wood from top to bottom. The Bible fell open to Romans 6:23. "For the wages of sin is death." But beneath the verse, written in crimson, was a name. James Merrow, the groundkeeper, the man who was still alive. Father Brown rushed outside, heart pounding. Merrow's quarters were empty. The tools lay scattered, his bed untouched, but on the wall someone had written a message, in ash. "He buried me in prayer." He stumbled back, suddenly aware that every bell in the church tower had begun to ring at once, though the ropes hung still. The sound was deafening, holy, terrifying. The next morning, when the villagers entered, they found Father Brown standing by the altar, pale, trembling, but alive. The bells had stopped. The inspector demanded answers. "What happened, Father? What did you see?" Father Brown looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Some sins are committed in silence. Others are disguised as blessings." The inspector frowned. "Are you saying Hale was guilty?" Father Brown hesitated. He was guilty, but not alone. That evening, the inspector found something that made no sense. A letter dated 5 years prior, written by Merrow, addressed to Father Hale. It read like a plea, not a threat. "You promised me salvation, but you gave me burial. The words you spoke over me were not prayers, they were chains." The ink trailed off in a dark smear. By the time the letter reached its end, it was signed not by Merrow's hand, but by Father Hale's. 2 signatures, the same handwriting, the same man. The inspector called it madness, forgery, a delusion shared between priest and parishioner. But Father Brown knew better. He had read Hale's notes, heard his sermons, studied his eyes. He knew that the man who had stood at the altar preaching redemption was not a liar in the simple sense. He was a man haunted by the crime of becoming God in his own mind. He had spoken the rights over Merrow, not as mercy, but as punishment. A living man condemned by holy words that worked like a curse. Hale had believed his own sermons so deeply that he'd made them true. And when Merrow returned, walking, breathing, alive, Hale saw not resurrection, but blasphemy, a miracle reversed. By the end of the week, both men were buried, one in the churchyard, one beneath it, and the whispers stopped, for a time, until the night the new priest arrived. He unlocked the church, lit the candles, and opened the old pulpit Bible to prepare his first sermon. There, in the margin beside Romans 6:23, was a fresh line of ink, not in Hale's hand, not in Father Brown's, just 5 words. "The murderer still preaches here." When Father Brown was asked later whether he believed in curses, he simply smiled, eyes distant. "Not curses," he said, "just prayers that were answered by the wrong voice." He closed the Bible gently, as though it were alive. And as he turned away, the bells began to ring again, softly, almost reverently, though no one touched the ropes. He looked up at the tower, then whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And somewhere within those holy walls, between the cracks of confession and sin, the whisper returned. This time, it laughed. Chapter 6. The bell rang before death. The church bell rang 3 times, 7 minutes before the murder. Every villager heard it. Every clock confirmed it. The bell rang before the man was killed, and no one, not a single living soul, was inside the tower. It began on a fog-sunk evening in Kembleford, when Father Brown was awakened by that unnatural sound. 3 deep, deliberate tolls rolling through the mist, slow, mournful, precise. He knew the pattern, the death bell. It was the signal reserved for a passing soul. But there had been no funeral planned, no dying parishioner to pray for. And yet, as the final echo faded, the sound was replaced by something else. A scream. By morning, the inspector stood outside the rectory, face pale. "Arthur Penrose," he said grimly, "dead, strangled in his home. No signs of forced entry, no robbery. But here's the thing, Father." His clock stopped at exactly the same time the bell rang. Father Brown's heart tightened. 7 minutes before death. The inspector frowned. "What did you say?" "Nothing," Father Brown murmured. "Just thinking." But he wasn't just thinking. He was remembering. Because the bell of St. Mary's had rung before death once before, 30 years ago, on the night Father Brown took his vows. He had thought it coincidence then. Now it felt like a curse, returning to finish what it started. The villagers were terrified. Some said the bell had always been haunted. Others swore it was the Angelus of death, tolling to warn the living. But Father Brown, though steeped in faith, believed in human sin far more than supernatural chance. Bells did not ring themselves. He climbed the tower that same evening. The air grew colder with each step. The great bronze bell hung still, coated in dust and spider webs. No footprints disturbed the floor beneath it. The rope was looped neatly against the wall, untouched. And yet, he noticed something. A small fleck of red on the clapper. Blood. Fresh. He wiped it gently, testing the smear. It was real. Something, or someone, had touched the bell before the murder. When he returned to the rectory, there was a letter waiting for him, sealed with black wax. No name, only one line written inside. "The bell rings for those who lie." He stared at the words for a long time, his breath caught. Arthur Penrose had been a banker, upright, polished, respected. But Father Brown had heard his confession once. The man was not as innocent as his reputation suggested. That night, he went to the Penrose house. The inspector had already left, leaving 2 constables guarding the door. They let him in reluctantly. The body lay where it had been found, by the fireplace, one hand reaching toward the mantel. His face was peaceful, too peaceful. Something about the stillness disturbed Father Brown more than the violence. Murder usually left a trace of chaos. Tipped chairs, broken glass, a hint of struggle. But this scene felt arranged, like a performance. He noticed the soot on the fireplace bricks, 3 smudges, spaced evenly, almost like fingerprints, but too small to be a man's. He crouched closer. Beneath the soot lay faint words, written in ash. "Forgive us." Not "forgive me." Us. Father Brown felt the room darken around him. He lifted a photo frame from the mantel. It showed Arthur Penrose standing beside his wife Margaret, smiling. But the glass was cracked, through Margaret's face, not his. When he returned to the church, the wind was howling through the bell tower. The ropes swayed, though no one touched them, and faintly, beneath the moaning gusts, he heard something. Music. The organ. He hurried down the steps. The church was empty, but the organ keys pressed themselves, moving in jagged rhythm. The melody was uneven, wrong, like someone trying to recall a hymn they'd forgotten years ago. He recognized it. Dies Irae, the chant of judgment. And then the whisper came. 7 minutes before death. He froze. The sound wasn't in his ear. It was in his mind, like a thought that wasn't his own. The next day, the inspector brought news. "Father, we've got a problem. Penrose's wife vanished last night." Father Brown nodded slowly. "She didn't vanish. She fled." The inspector scowled. "You think she killed him?" "No," Father Brown said softly. "I think she watched him die." He went back to the bell tower, where the blood still marked the clapper. Something about it gnawed at him. He noticed tiny streaks of soot beside it, like a handprint. The same soot from the Penrose fireplace. Whoever touched the bell had also been in that house. That evening, as he prayed, the church bell tolled again. 3 times. He ran to the tower, but the bell was silent. The sound had come from nowhere, and yet it had filled the whole valley. He turned back toward the church and saw a shadow standing at the altar. A woman. Margaret Penrose. Her face was streaked with rain, her hands shaking. "It wasn't me," she whispered. "I know," Father Brown said quietly, "but someone wants you to think it was." She stepped closer. "He made me swear, before God. Said the bell would ring if I ever broke my word." "What word?" "That I'd stay silent." Father Brown felt the floor tilt beneath him. Silent about what? She looked at him, tears mixing with fear. "The body." He leaned forward. "What body?" "The first one," she said. "The one from 30 years ago." For a long moment, neither spoke. The air grew heavy. "The bell didn't ring before death," she whispered. "It rings for what's buried underneath." That night, the storm broke. Rain lashed the stained glass windows, lightning cracked above the steeple, and thunder rolled through the village like the sound of judgment. Father Brown climbed the tower once more. He couldn't escape the feeling that someone, was waiting for him up there. The bell swung slightly, creaking on its ancient beam. Beneath it, the floorboards were uneven. He knelt, pried one up with his pocket knife. The smell hit him immediately: damp wood, rot, and something worse. Under the planks lay a small cavity filled with cloth and bone. A skeleton. He lifted the fabric carefully. It was a priest's robe, the collar still intact. He reached into the pocket and found a rosary. The beads were blackened by age. The cross was cracked. Father Brown whispered a prayer, though his voice trembled. The bones were too old to belong to Arthur Penrose, but they matched the timeline Margaret had spoken of. 30 years, and in that instant, he knew. The bell hadn't just been warning of death, it was remembering it. When he descended from the tower, dawn was bleeding into the sky. The inspector was waiting below, soaked from the rain. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. Father Brown glanced at the church behind him. "Not a ghost," he replied. "A secret that's been trying to speak." The inspector frowned. "What secret?" "The bell was never cursed. It was used." Used? By someone who needed to confess without words. Later that day, they exhumed the hidden remains. Forensics identified the bones as belonging to Father Matthias, Father Brown's mentor, the first priest of St. Mary's. He had vanished decades ago, believed to have left for mission work. But he hadn't left. He had been murdered and hidden beneath his own bell tower. The inspector looked at Father Brown in disbelief. "You think Arthur Penrose knew?" "I think he did more than know," Father Brown murmured. "He inherited the guilt." In the rectory, he unfolded the old parish registry. The name Arthur Penrose appeared at the bottom of one page, not as a banker, but as a bell ringer. He had served the church as a boy, under Father Matthias. He would have known every creak, every pull of that rope, every secret buried beneath those stones. Father Brown returned to the bell tower that night, unable to rest. The rain had stopped. The air was cold, clean. He touched the great bronze surface and whispered, "Who killed you?" For a moment, there was nothing. Then the bell moved. A single chime, soft, hollow, and then a voice, not human, not ghostly, but something between the two, echoed through the chamber. "He did." Father Brown turned sharply. Arthur Penrose stood there, or what was left of him, his eyes empty, his expression peaceful, the same face from the photograph on the mantel. "You killed him," Father Brown whispered. Penrose smiled faintly. "He told me to." "Father Matthias?" "He said the devil had taken root in him, said he must die before the church fell with him. I believed him. Then why confess now?" Penrose's smile faded. "Because he lied. He wasn't trying to save me. He was trying to save himself." The air grew colder. Penrose's image began to fade. "I buried him beneath the bell," the voice said softly, "and every time it rings, I remember the lie." The figure dissolved into mist. The bell swung once more, tolling its mournful tone. When the inspector found Father Brown hours later, he was standing alone, hands folded, staring up at the bell. "The case is over," the inspector said quietly. "We know who did it, but we'll never understand why." Father Brown didn't answer. He only whispered, "The bell did." As he left the church, dawn broke through the clouds, scattering light across the graveyard. But behind him, the bell rang one final time. 3 slow tolls that no one else heard. He paused at the gate and said, almost to himself, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And for a moment, as the morning wind carried the sound across the village, it almost sounded like the bell was laughing. Chapter 7. One Truth Shattered. Father Brown had solved over 100 murders in his lifetime. But the one truth he never questioned was the one that finally destroyed him. It came wrapped not in blood, but in parchment. Delivered in silence. No stamp, no name. Just the words, "You've absolved the wrong man." That morning, the chapel pews were half empty. Rain scratched against the stained glass windows like fingernails. He should have been preparing for Sunday's sermon, but his hands trembled too much to write. The letter lay in front of him like a live thing. He had seen death in many forms, cold, frenzied, accidental, but this was something else. The handwriting was familiar, almost too familiar, the kind that wrote scripture in the margins with reverence and secrets, the kind he hadn't seen in 12 years. The name at the bottom, hidden, unsigned, burned brighter in his mind than any flame, because he knew exactly who had written it, and that man had hanged by Father Brown's own testimony. 12 years ago, a girl had been found strangled behind the organ loft. Lily Marsh, choir voice like a sparrow, hands bruised from a struggle, mouth open as if mid-prayer. The village mourned, and justice was swift. James Kettering, a gardener with a temper and no alibi, was arrested, tried, and hanged. Father Brown had been the last to hear his confession. Kettering had said only one thing in the end. She didn't scream because she trusted him. And now, 12 years later, someone had reopened the wound with one brutal sentence. He didn't sleep that night. Every creak in the chapel felt like a footstep, every candle flicker a warning. The next morning, the inspector arrived, not with answers, but with another letter. Same handwriting, different message. "You missed the sin that stood beside you. The devil wears a collar too." The inspector frowned. "We think it might be a prank, someone angry about Kettering's sentence." But Father Brown's voice was hollow. "This isn't a prank. This is a correction." He went to the archives alone. The box labeled L. Marsh 1909 had gathered so much dust it coughed when he touched it. Inside, crime scene sketches, a rosary broken in half, the girl's sheet music stained with tears, and photographs. One of them was wrong. The photograph had never been submitted in the trial. It showed Lily laughing in the courtyard with two priests beside her. One was Father Brown. The other was Father Ignatius. He hadn't seen Ignatius since the trial. He had moved abroad, sent by the diocese on extended retreat. Back then, no one questioned it. Now, Father Brown couldn't breathe. There had always been rumors, whispers, nothing solid. Ignatius was charming, intelligent, and admired. But Lily had flinched once when he brushed past her in the hallway. Father Brown remembered it now. Too late. He returned to the church, climbed to the loft where Lily's body had been found. The dust was undisturbed. But behind the wooden crossbeam, he saw it. A small carving in the wood. Just one word. Forgive. It was carved with a trembling hand, and it hadn't been there before. He knelt, heart racing, eyes stinging. The next night, the third letter came. If you truly wish to atone, follow the hymn backwards. He sat at the organ, fingers shaking. The last hymn Lily had played was Agnus Dei. He played it in reverse, and there it was, a melody hidden in the notes, deliberate, chilling, like a second song inside the first. He followed the notes to the sacristy, and inside the drawer, beneath the altar linen, he found the final piece, a torn page from Lily's diary. He asked me to come after choir, said he had a gift. I don't like the way he looks at me, but I can't say no. He's a priest. The next line was scratched out, deeply. Father Brown sat in silence for an hour. Then he wept, not because he'd missed it, but because he had believed in something so completely that it blinded him. He had defended Ignatius during the trial, dismissed rumors, trusted the cloth more than the conscience, and now, a dead man, bore the punishment for a crime he didn't commit. He walked to the inspector's office that night, carrying the diary page and the photograph. The inspector listened, slowly putting the pieces together. If what you're saying is true, then the real killer was a priest. Father Brown didn't answer. He only handed him the photograph again. The inspector blinked. Ignatius, but he's dead. Died in Rome last year. Stroke. Father Brown nodded. But truth doesn't die. It only waits. The inspector looked down. What do you want me to do, Father? Exhume a ghost? Father Brown whispered. No. I want you to tell the village they believed a lie. The inspector stood slowly. That'll shatter people. I know, Father Brown said. It already shattered me. The next Sunday, he stood at the pulpit, hands trembling. The chapel was full. He looked out and saw the faces, some old, some new. None knew the whole story. I cannot preach today, he said softly, because I once spoke falsehood from this very spot. The silence was immediate. I stood here 12 years ago and said justice had been done. I was wrong. Gasps, murmurs. I trusted the cloth over the truth. I thought a man's title made him pure. I forgot that wolves wear robes too. A woman stood in the back. He hadn't seen her before. Younger, pale. She met his gaze and nodded once. The letters had stopped, but her presence answered the last question. Lily's sister. She had written them. She had forced the truth out. And as Father Brown stepped down from the pulpit, his soul heavier than it had ever been. The bell rang outside, once, not for death, for reckoning. And though the case would never reach the courts, and the diocese would bury it quietly, the truth had cracked open the stone at the center of his faith. He sat alone that night, staring at the crucifix, then whispered the words only he would ever hear. I know who did it, and this time, the truth had to be told. But somewhere inside, a voice answered, then why did it take 12 years? He had no reply. Chapter 8. Final confession stopped mid-sentence. The man died halfway through saying Father Brown's name. He was kneeling in the confessional, breath hitching, hands trembling, his voice low and desperate. Forgive me, Father, for I have... And then the sound. Not a gasp, not a sigh, a wet crack like something breaking inside him. The next moment, he was slumped forward, eyes open, mouth still moving. But no sound came. The light behind the grill flickered, and Father Brown's own voice seemed trapped in his throat. He reached through the partition, shaking the man's shoulder, but the body was already cold. Too cold. As if death hadn't just arrived. It had been waiting there. He stepped out, heart pounding, to find the chapel empty. No witnesses, no movement, just the faint smell of iron hanging in the air. Blood. But there was no wound, not a drop on the floor. Only a small scrap of paper clutched in the man's hand, soaked through with sweat. Father Brown pried it open carefully. 3 words, written in smudged ink. I found her. Her who? The dead man was Arthur Wynne, a quiet bookseller from the village, known for his stammer and his solitary life. He had no enemies, no debt, no reason for confession at midnight. Yet he had begged entry, pale and frantic, insisting he had something to tell the priest, something about a woman who never died. By morning, the inspector was already pacing the nave. Heart failure, he declared, though even he didn't believe it. No bruises, no poison, nothing. He just stopped. Father Brown stood by the confessional, silent. The echo of those unfinished words still lingered like a curse. Forgive me, Father, for I have... What? Sinned? Killed? Lied? Or remembered something he shouldn't have? When the constables carried the body away, Father Brown noticed a faint red mark around Wynne's throat. Not a strangulation bruise, too precise for that. More like a burn. A thin, perfect line encircling the neck, like a collar made of flame. That night, he went to the bookshop. Dust lay thick across every shelf, as if no one had entered in days. The smell of ink and parchment filled the air, mixed with something faintly metallic. The ledger on the counter was open to a single entry. 1 book returned, not mine. He turned the page. Pressed flower petals fell out, blackened, brittle. Beneath them, another note in Wynne's hand. She speaks through margins. Father Brown's pulse quickened. He pulled the nearest volume from the shelf, an old hymnal bound in cracked leather. Inside, certain words had been underlined, one on each page, forming a hidden sentence. I wait beneath the rose window. He didn't sleep that night. At dawn, he walked back to the church. The rising sun filtered through the stained glass rose, painting red and gold across the stone floor. Everything was silent, too silent. And then he saw it. Beneath the window, where the light touched the ground, something was carved into the stone, fresh. Forgive me, Father. He knelt beside it. The grooves were shallow, shaky, as if made by a trembling hand. His hand brushed over the letters, and a strange coldness shot through him. For a moment, he thought he heard a whisper, faint, feminine, barely there. He found me. He froze. When he told the inspector, the man laughed nervously. So, now the stones talk? But Father Brown's face was pale. No, he said quietly. They listen. That evening, he returned alone. The confession booth still reeked faintly of iron. The candle inside had melted down into a pool of wax, its shape warped like a skull. He touched the seat where Wynne had died. Still cold. Too cold. He opened the grill. On the other side, the penitent's side, something caught the light. A single black thread hanging from the wood, barely visible. He pulled it free. It wasn't thread, it was hair. Long, dark, burned at the end. But Arthur Wynne had been balding. He wrapped it carefully in cloth and placed it inside his pocket. Something told him the answer wasn't in the living at all. The next day, a letter arrived for him. No address, no return mark. Only his name, written in a child's hand. Inside was a torn photograph. A young woman stood before the rose window, smiling faintly, a book pressed to her chest. Across the bottom edge, someone had written, Evelyn Marsh, 1887. Evelyn Marsh had died 40 years ago, buried in the churchyard. Father Brown felt a chill ripple through his spine. He went to the cemetery after dusk, lantern trembling in his grasp. The rain had turned the earth slick. The grave was easy to find. Evelyn Marsh, beloved daughter. But the soil looked disturbed. Recently, as if someone had dug there. He knelt, touched the wet ground, and felt something hard beneath the surface. He scraped gently with his hands until the lantern caught the gleam of metal, a locket. He opened it. Inside, a lock of hair, dark, burned at the tip, the same hair from the confessional. And opposite it, a photograph. Arthur Wynne, alive, smiling, standing beside Evelyn Marsh. Father Brown's breath caught. She'd died 40 years ago. Wynne wasn't yet born when the photograph was taken. He stumbled back. The wind howled through the trees, making the bell above the church toll once, soft, hollow, and wrong. He knew then that the dead man's final words weren't a confession. They were a message. I found her. He went straight to the archives. The records told a story long forgotten. Evelyn Marsh had been a teacher at the parish school, engaged to a man named Gregory Wynne. Her fiancé had vanished days before their wedding. His body was never found. Evelyn was found dead soon after. No wounds, no poison. Her heart simply stopped. The death was ruled natural, but it wasn't. The inspector met him the next morning. You look like hell, he muttered. She died waiting for him, Father Brown said, and now he's come back. The inspector frowned. You mean Arthur Wynne? No, Father Brown whispered. Gregory Wynne. The inspector hesitated. Father, Gregory Wynne's been dead for nearly a century. Then who walked into my confessional last night? The inspector didn't answer. Later that evening, Father Brown sat in the church alone. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes. The candlelight flickered. The confessional stood open. He whispered, If you have something to say, say it. The curtain rustled. The wooden seat creaked. And then, her voice, soft, sad. He found me, but he brought the wrong soul. The temperature dropped sharply. Frost crawled across the wood. Father Brown's breath misted in the air. Who are you? He asked. No answer, only the faintest hum. A tune, a hymn. He recognized it, Evelyn's favorite. He stood quickly, the candles sputtering out. The church plunged into darkness. And then came the sound, the faint dragging scrape of something across stone, from behind the altar. He followed the noise. The wind outside roared. Thunder rolled. There, behind the altar, he saw it. The wall had cracked open slightly, and beneath it lay something wrapped in cloth. He reached down, pulled the fabric back. Bones. A skeleton, curled tightly. A woman's bones. And around her neck, a rosary, blackened by time. He stared in silence. The last missing piece. Evelyn Marsh hadn't died in her home. She'd died here, and she'd never been buried. As he whispered a prayer, a gust of cold air swept through the church, knocking over every candle. The bell above began to toll, not by rope, not by hand, but by something else. Each ring felt heavier, deeper, closer. Father Brown knelt. "You may rest now," he whispered. But the voice that answered wasn't Evelyn's. It was Arthur Wynn's. "Rest? She won't let me." The sound echoed through the rafters, through the very bones of the church. Father Brown's heart pounded. He turned, searching the shadows, but saw nothing, only the confessional door swinging open and shut, in rhythm with the bell. The inspector burst in moments later, shouting over the wind. "Father, what's happening?" Father Brown turned slowly, eyes wide. "He's still confessing." "Who?" "Wynn. But he's dead." "Father," Brown's voice broke. "He never finished his confession." They found the confessional empty. No one inside. But on the seat where Wynn had died lay another scrap of paper, soaked through with tears or rain, or both. It said, "Forgive me. She remembers." By dawn, the church was quiet again. The bell was still. The crack in the wall was gone. The skeleton beneath the altar vanished. The inspector left, shaken. "We'll call it a collapse," he said. "The stress, the storm." But Father Brown stayed behind. He knew what he'd heard, what he'd seen, and he knew one truth that terrified him most. Confessions never die. That evening, as he prepared the chapel for Vespers, he noticed something on the wall behind the confessional, words written faintly in chalk. "Finish what he started." He touched the letters. The chalk smeared under his fingers. Then came the whisper, a man's voice, broken. "Forgive me, Father, for I have—" Silence. The sentence stopped, just as before. He turned sharply, heart pounding. The confessional curtain swayed, though no wind moved through the room. He approached, opened it slowly. Empty. Only the faint scent of lilies remained. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Outside, the bell began to ring again. One slow, steady toll that echoed across the village. The same toll that would always sound just before a soul tried to speak what the living were never meant to hear. Chapter 9. She lied inside the confessional. The woman confessed to a murder that hadn't happened yet. Her voice shook through the confessional grill, steady at first, then cracking in places where guilt, or something far worse, clawed through. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I will kill him tonight." Father Brown froze. He had heard many sins whispered through that small wooden partition. Envy, theft, betrayal, but never a prophecy of murder. Never someone confessing a crime before committing it. "Child," he said carefully, "you mean you intend to harm someone?" "No, Father," she replied, calm now. "It's already done." He frowned. "But you just said it hasn't happened." The silence that followed was so long it became unbearable. Finally, she whispered, "You'll understand tomorrow." And then, before he could speak, the sound came, her footsteps leaving the booth, the echo of the church doors closing behind her. He should have gone after her. He should have asked her name. But something in her tone, paralyzed him. It wasn't fear. It was familiarity. He knew that voice. When he stepped out of the confessional, the church was empty, the air heavy with incense, and the faint metallic scent of blood that seemed to cling to the wood. He knelt and prayed. For her, for the man she meant to kill, for the sin that hadn't yet been born. By dawn, the news came. A man was found dead in his home. No signs of forced entry, no struggle. His throat cut cleanly, as if by someone who loved him. And on the bedside table, a rosary, not his. The inspector arrived before the church bells finished ringing. "You heard something last night," he said flatly. "Didn't you?" Father Brown looked away. "I can't say." "Confession?" He nodded. The inspector cursed under his breath. "She told you she'd kill him?" He didn't answer. The inspector leaned closer. "If you keep silent, Father, she'll kill again." Father Brown's voice was barely a whisper. "She already has." The victim's name was Thomas Avery, a wealthy benefactor of the church, generous in public, ruthless in private, and now, cold as marble in his bed, hands folded like he died mid-prayer. Father Brown walked through Avery's study later that afternoon, escorted by the inspector. The curtains were drawn, the room smelled of ink and whiskey. On the desk lay a torn letter, half burned in the fireplace. The only words still legible: "You can't keep her buried forever." Father Brown touched the edges of the paper. It was recent, too recent. He turned to the inspector. "Was he married?" "Widowed," the man replied. 5 years ago, wife drowned. Tragic accident. Fell from the pier near the rectory." Father Brown's breath caught. He remembered the funeral, the pale coffin, the storm that followed, and the widow's name, Eleanor Avery. The same voice, the same quiet tremor in her tone when she had come to confession years ago, begging for forgiveness, not for something she had done, but for something she couldn't undo. Now she had returned. That night, the church was empty again. He waited, lantern burning low, wind howling through the rafters. At exactly midnight, the confessional curtain moved. He steadied himself. "You came back." "Yes," she said. "You always knew I would." Her voice was low, melodic, but hollow, like an echo of itself. "You lied," he said softly. "About what?" "You said you'd kill him tonight, but when you spoke those words, he was already dead." A pause, then a faint laugh. "You still don't understand, Father. I didn't lie. I confessed his sin, not mine." He leaned forward, trying to see her through the grill, but there was only shadow. "He confessed to me before he died," she continued. "He told me what he did to her. To me." "Eleanor," he whispered, "your husband's been dead for hours." The whisper that came back chilled him to the core. "That wasn't my husband." The confessional went silent. He pushed open the door, empty, the seat still warm, the scent of her perfume lingering. But she was gone. The next morning, he returned to Avery's house. The inspector met him there, tired, grim. "We found something strange," he said. "Behind the bookshelf in his study, a door, a hidden one." Father Brown followed him through the narrow passage. Dust thick, air stale. The tunnel led down into a cellar. There, beneath the floorboards, they found it. A coffin. Small, child-sized. Inside, bones, and wrapped around them, a rosary. The same rosary left at Avery's bedside. The inspector looked sick. "His daughter. She died before the wife, didn't she?" "Fever?" Father Brown nodded slowly. "That's what he told us." "But this isn't fever," the inspector said. "This is murder." The world tilted. The pieces began to fall into place. Eleanor Avery hadn't killed out of vengeance. She had killed out of truth. Her husband had killed their daughter, buried her in secret, and drowned his wife when she discovered it. But that couldn't be. She was alive. She had come to confession. Unless she never left. That night, the bell tower rang at the wrong hour. 3 short tolls, the pattern reserved for funeral rites. He climbed the stairs to the choir loft. The air was heavy with mist. Below him, the confessional stood in shadow. He saw her then. Eleanor Avery, kneeling before the altar, veil covering her face, her hands clasped tight, rosary glinting between her fingers. He approached slowly. "Eleanor?" She didn't move. He stepped closer. The air grew colder. When he touched her shoulder, the veil slipped away. No face, only dust. The rosary fell to the floor, shattering into pieces. The inspector found him minutes later, trembling. "There's no one here, Father." He looked down at his hands, still covered in the dust that wasn't dust at all. Ash. They searched the church from bell tower to crypt, but there was no sign of Eleanor Avery, only the faint imprint of knees on the stone floor. That evening, Father Brown sat in the rectory, the shattered rosary laid out before him. He counted the missing beads. 3 were gone. He knew what that meant. 3 deaths still owed. The next day, the inspector burst through the door. "Father, you'd better come." 2 more bodies had been found. Both men, both linked to Thomas Avery's business, and in both homes, a single bead, placed neatly on the windowsill. The inspector ran a hand through his hair. "You think she's doing it? Ghost or not, someone's finishing her work." Father Brown's face was pale. "No," he said softly. "She's not killing the guilty. She's saving them." The inspector blinked. "Saving them?" "She lied inside the confessional," Father Brown murmured, "but not about her sin. About her purpose." "What purpose?" "To keep them from confessing." The inspector stared. "You're saying she's silencing them?" "Yes," Father Brown whispered, "because if they confessed, their sins would live forever in the church's memory. She's erasing them instead." That night, Father Brown sat alone in the confessional, waiting, listening. Midnight came, the air grew heavy, and then the latch clicked, the curtain moved. "Forgive me, Father," the voice said, soft, trembling, achingly familiar. He closed his eyes. "Eleanor." "No," she whispered. "You don't recognize me?" He froze. The voice wasn't hers. It was younger, softer. A girl's. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm the one he buried." His blood ran cold. "The child?" "Yes." He gripped the edge of the seat. "Why come to me?" "Because she lied," the girl said. "She said death would end it. But it doesn't. It never does." The candle beside him flickered out. When light returned, the confessional was empty. The next morning, the inspector found Father Brown at the altar, staring at the crucifix. "Did she come back?" he asked quietly. Father Brown didn't look away from the cross. "Yes," he said softly, "but not to kill, to confess." The inspector frowned. "To confess what?" Father Brown turned, eyes hollow. "That she lied inside the confessional, about who deserved forgiveness." The inspector hesitated. "What does that mean?" "It means," Father Brown said, "she wasn't the sinner. She was the priest." The words hit the inspector like a blow. "Father, that's not possible." But Father Brown was already walking toward the door, rosary beads clinking faintly in his hand. "She lied," he whispered, "and I believed her. I absolved the wrong soul." Outside, the bell began to toll again. 3 times, slow, final. The inspector called after him, but Father Brown didn't turn back. He only whispered to himself, voice barely audible over the echoing chimes. "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And somewhere deep inside the confessional, where wood met shadow and shadow met faith, a faint voice whispered back, soft, almost kind, "You already told it, Father." Chapter 10. He died holding a secret. The old man died with a smile on his lips and a sealed envelope clenched so tightly in his fist that they had to break his fingers to remove it. It was a Wednesday, just before dawn, when Father Brown was summoned to the Whitby estate. The manor stood like a ghost on the hill, soaked in sea mist and the weight of 3 centuries of secrets. Sir Julian Whitby, retired judge and the last of his line, had died in his sleep. Or so they thought. But something about his death didn't sit right. There was no sign of struggle, no wound, no trace of poison. He was found in his study chair, facing the fireplace, as if dozing. But his expression wasn't peaceful. It was knowing, triumphant. And his right hand was clenched in a death grip around a heavy white envelope sealed in black wax. The housekeeper had tried to pry it free. She couldn't. Not even the constable could. In the end, the coroner had to snap his fingers one by one, and even then, the hand closed again, twitching like the body was trying to take the secret back to the grave. When the inspector showed the envelope to Father Brown, he noticed the wax was unbroken. No name, no address, just one line scrawled across the front. "Do not open until after my death, unless I am murdered." That was when everything changed, because according to every medical opinion, Sir Julian had died of natural causes, heart failure. But this envelope, it suggested otherwise. It suggested he knew someone would try to silence him, that he had something worth dying for. Father Brown stood beside the body, staring at the parchment as if it might speak. "What do you think's inside?" the inspector asked. "A name," Father Brown murmured. "Maybe more than one." "Of who?" Father Brown didn't answer. Not yet. That evening, he sat alone in the chapel with the envelope. The black wax gleamed in the candlelight like a shadow given form. He turned it over. No slits, no tampering, unopened, untouched, waiting. He placed it on the altar and prayed. Not for clarity, for courage. Because whatever was inside, it was the kind of truth that breaks things. The next morning, the housekeeper returned with something else, a journal. Sir Julian's, bound in red leather, pages cracked with age. She found it hidden beneath a loose floorboard behind the study bookshelf. The final entry read simply, "The bells always ring before the end. I heard them again last night. I think she's come back." Father Brown's blood chilled. "She," he whispered. He remembered the case, the one Sir Julian had buried for decades. Eleanor Hayes, a maid at the estate, 20 years old, intelligent, sharp, and dead. Found in the well on the property in 1903. Her death ruled an accident. No autopsy. No questions. Sir Julian, then a young magistrate, oversaw the entire inquest. The journal continued. "I should have spoken. But the others, what we did, was unforgivable. They'll come for me now. Not to kill me, to remind me. That's worse." Father Brown closed the book slowly. The sealed envelope pulsed in his mind like a wound. He asked the inspector for the original inquest report. Most of the documents were missing. What remained had been redacted, names removed, pages missing, but one line survived. Witness testimony suppressed under order of the Crown. Suppressed by Sir Julian himself. That night, the chapel windows rattled with wind. The candles hissed. The bell tolled twice. No one had pulled the rope. Father Brown opened the confessional, feeling the weight of something intangible pressing down. The sealed envelope lay beside him. The wax looked darker now, thicker, like it was sealing something alive. He couldn't sleep. At dawn, he visited the well behind the Whitby estate, overgrown, sealed with stone. But the chill that rose from it was not natural. A cross was etched into the side, not old, fresh, and beneath it, scratched so faintly he nearly missed it. asked the priest what he saw. He staggered back. He had never met Eleanor Hayes. She died before his arrival. But someone thought otherwise. When he returned to the chapel, the envelope was gone. He searched the altar, the pews, the floor. Nothing. Then he found it, placed neatly on the seat inside the confessional, opened, the wax broken. He stared at it in horror. His hands shook as he lifted the flap. Inside, one sheet of paper. Blank. No writing, no name. But there was something else. A single white hair. Long, curled at the end. Not Sir Julian's. He ran to the inspector's office, explained everything. But when they returned, the envelope was sealed again. The wax fresh, unbroken. The inspector thought he was losing his mind. Father Brown wasn't sure he wasn't. Until the next death. Sir Julian's brother, Henry Whitby, dead in his garden. Heart attack, they said, but his mouth was open, mid-scream, and clutched in his hand another envelope. Same parchment, same wax, same message. Do not open unless I am murdered. That night, the church bells rang again, 3 times, and every candle in the chapel blew out. In the morning, Father Brown found a name scratched into the altar wood. Eleanor. The inspector ordered the Whitby crypt opened. Sir Julian had been interred less than a week. When they opened the coffin, they found the body intact. But the envelope was gone, vanished. In its place, his heart, removed, held in a silk pouch, still warm. No one could explain it. By then, the villagers had stopped coming to Mass. Too many whispers, too many bells. Father Brown lit the candles each night, waited in silence. He found the envelope again, weeks later, in his own study, placed on his desk, sealed. No message this time, but inside, 3 photographs, all taken on the same day in 1903. Sir Julian, Henry Whitby, and a third man, Father Malcolm, the previous priest, who vanished without a trace after Eleanor's death. On the back of the photos, one line in Eleanor's hand. He knew. He said nothing. Father Brown dropped the photos. They curled slightly in the candle heat, edges blackening. He understood then. The envelope never held a confession. It held memory, judgment, names written not in ink, but in guilt. When the inspector asked him if the case was closed, Father Brown answered quietly, "No, but the door is." That evening, he sat in the confessional. The air was cold. He felt her before he saw her. The curtain shifted. A presence, a breath, a voice, soft, young, timeless. "He died holding a secret, Father." He swallowed. "Yes. So will you." The wind howled. The bell rang. One toll. Final. He bowed his head. "I know who did it," he whispered, "but the truth will never be told." And the silence that followed was not peace. It was warning. Chapter 11. The letter Father Brown burned. The letter arrived sealed with red wax, soaked through with what looked like rainwater, until Father Brown realized it was blood. It came with no name, no return address, only a trembling postman who said, "It felt warm, Father, like it was breathing." The moment he touched it, he knew. Whatever was inside that envelope wasn't meant for mortal eyes. He laid it on his desk, beneath the crucifix, staring at it in silence. The wax shimmered faintly, the seal stamped not with a crest, but a single symbol, an open eye, watching. He'd seen that mark once before, 15 years ago, at the trial of a man who'd begged him not to testify. A man later hanged for murder. A man who, with his last breath, had whispered, "You'll read my words one day, Father, when it's too late." The letter waited. By midnight, the rain had turned into a storm. He could hear the church groaning as the wind pushed against the glass. The candles flickered violently, bending as if toward the envelope. He shouldn't have opened it. He knew that. But temptation has its own theology, one that preys on the curious and the faithful alike. The wax cracked with a hiss. Inside was a single page, handwritten. He began to read. The first line made his stomach turn. You condemned the wrong man. The ink was dark, the handwriting unmistakable. It was Edward Vale's, the man who died on the gallows 15 years ago. Father Brown read on, his hands trembling. She wasn't dead when you found her. You buried her alive. He stopped breathing. The words swam before his eyes. He looked again. Same sentence, same accusation. Impossible. He remembered the case. Clara Vale, Edward's wife, a woman whose beauty and madness had haunted the village for years. Found at the base of the churchyard steps, her head bloodied. Edward Vale, drunk and raving, standing over her body. Everyone had seen him that night. Everyone believed he'd done it, even Father Brown. But what if he hadn't? What if she hadn't been dead? The letter continued. There was a sound beneath the coffin lid that night. The gravedigger heard it. He never spoke again. A drop of wax from the candle splashed onto the page, smearing the words. He reached for a cloth, but the ink began to bleed, spreading like veins through the paper. You thought you buried truth, Father, but truth doesn't rot. He folded the letter shut, heart hammering. That night, he couldn't sleep. The rain wouldn't stop. Somewhere outside, a bell tolled once. No hour, no chime, just a single note echoing through the storm. He prayed until dawn. But prayer felt hollow, like words spoken into a locked room. The next morning, the inspector came. Found a body, he said grimly, at the edge of the churchyard. Old man, hands bloody, no sign of struggle. Who? Father Brown asked. The gravedigger. The words hit like a hammer. The inspector frowned. There was something in his pocket. Thought you'd want to see it. He handed over a small, dirt-stained scrap of paper, written in the same hand as the letter. The bell will ring for her again. That night, the church bell tolled twice. Father Brown climbed the steps to the belfry, the letter still clutched in his hand. The ropes hung still, unmoving, the mechanism untouched, and yet the air vibrated with sound. When he reached the top, he saw it, a shape in the shadows, a woman standing with her back to him, her dress soaked as though from rain that hadn't fallen in years, her hair tangled, her shoulders trembling. Clara, he whispered. She turned. Her eyes were open, but they didn't see. Her lips moved, but no sound came. And then she was gone. He fell to his knees. The letter burned in his pocket like a brand. He went to the archives, searching for the records of her burial. There was no coffin listed under her name, no grave marked on the map, but there was one plot noted as sealed under order of parish. He went there by lantern light. The grave lay beneath the yew tree. The soil was dark and uneven, as if something had tried to escape from beneath it. He pressed the lantern close. On the headstone, faintly visible under moss and thyme, were the words, Clara Vale, rest denied. He couldn't breathe. He staggered back toward the church, clutching the lantern. The shadows seemed to move around him. When he returned, the letter was gone. In its place, a second one. Same seal, same mark. He tore it open, hands shaking. You can't save her. You can only choose who burns next. And below it, a list of names. His, the inspector's, and one more, the bishop's. He dropped the letter into the fire, watching the edges curl and blacken. The flames flared blue for a moment before dying into ash. But when the smoke cleared, the paper was still there, unburned. He snatched it up and threw it again into the hearth, feeding it kindling and oil. The fire roared, licking at the parchment. He watched it finally crumble into black dust. He exhaled in relief, until he looked at the desk. The same letter lay there, unmarked, whole, waiting. The next morning, the bishop arrived unannounced. "You've been receiving letters," he said quietly. "They've been sent to others too. The same handwriting, the same accusations." Father Brown nodded. The bishop's face was pale. "They say Edward Vale's confession was falsified, that someone else wrote it for him." "Who?" The bishop hesitated. "The church clerk, the one who disappeared afterward." The room went still. Father Brown whispered, "He didn't disappear." The bishop frowned. "What are you saying?" "He's buried here." That night, Father Brown opened the cellar beneath the rectory. The damp air hit like a curse. He lifted the lantern and froze. There, etched into the wall in black ink, were dozens of letters. Not one, not two, dozens, each one the same. "You condemned the wrong man." And beneath them, scratched into the stone, "You burned the truth." He sank to his knees. The letter in his hand pulsed with heat. He dropped it. It burned by itself this time, without flame, without smoke. Only silence. The inspector found him hours later, sitting in the dark. "There's been another death," he said softly. "The bishop." Father Brown didn't answer. "They found something beside him," the inspector added. "A letter, burned halfway through." The inspector hesitated. "It had your name on it." Father Brown's eyes lifted slowly. "Mine?" "Yes, and one sentence still legible." He handed it over. Father Brown read the remaining words aloud. "He'll burn it again, but it will never die." The inspector looked uneasy. "What does it mean?" "It means," Father Brown said quietly, "the letter wasn't written by a man." He stood, walked to the hearth, and stared into the embers. The ashes stirred, as if something moved beneath them. He whispered, "I know who wrote it." "Who?" Father Brown's eyes reflected the glow of dying flame. "The one who never truly died." The inspector stared. "You mean Clara Vale?" Father Brown didn't respond. He only opened his hand. In his palm lay the charred wax seal, the open eye still watching. And as the firelight dimmed, the faint sound of a woman's laughter drifted through the church, soft, sad, accusing. By dawn, Father Brown had vanished. On his desk lay one final letter, sealed, the wax unbroken, addressed to no one. Just 6 words written across the front: "Do not burn what you buried." And beneath it, in smaller script, "The truth does not forgive." The inspector read it once and burned it, but the next morning the letter was back on his desk, untouched, the seal glinting red in the morning sun, waiting. And somewhere far away, in the chapel that had once belonged to Father Brown, the bell tolled once more, slow, deliberate, final, and those who heard it swore they could still smell smoke. Chapter 12. One sin Father Brown forgave. He strangled the bishop with the rosary he'd kissed the night before. It wasn't rage, it wasn't passion, it was a mercy he claimed, a mercy no soul ever asked for. And when the bishop's body was discovered at dawn, hands folded perfectly across his chest, not a soul in St. Elmo's parish could explain how the most pious man in the county had been murdered in prayer, with no sign of struggle, no cry for help, and not a single clue, except a single candle still burning at the altar, dripping blood instead of wax. They called it sacrilege. They called it a ritual. But Father Brown, who had walked that same aisle just hours before, paused beside the body with a look not of horror, but understanding. He touched the blood wax with one finger, pressed it to his lips, and whispered, "He forgave someone last night." The villagers were stunned, of course. The bishop, Father Ambrose, was beloved, albeit feared. A man who condemned sinners with the force of thunder from the pulpit and refused communion to those he deemed unworthy. And yet here he was, strangled with the very beads he wore daily around his wrist like a banner of righteousness. No signs of a break-in, no forced entry, just locked doors, silence, and the body of a holy man, eyes wide in terror or peace. No one could tell. Inspector Halford arrived before the morning bell stopped ringing, but even he looked lost. The servants had alibis. The other priests claimed they were asleep. The gardener was deaf, the maid was blind, and the sacristan, well, he had gone missing entirely. Gone, vanished, leaving only a single page torn from a hymnal and stuffed beneath the altar cloth. Its only words, "One sin I cannot undo." Father Brown stood quietly by, his hat clutched in his hands, head bowed, not in grief, but in some strange concentration, as if replaying something, a confession perhaps, a memory, a warning. When asked if he'd seen anything unusual, he replied only the usual sins, but some wear prettier disguises than others. No fingerprints, no weapon, save the rosary, which oddly had no marks, no blood, just the scent of old incense and the faintest trace of lavender. Not the bishop's scent, not from the church oils, something else, something no one could explain. The autopsy gave nothing new, no poisons, no bruises save the marks on his neck. The time of death, between 3 and 4 a.m., narrowed nothing. Every person in the rectory had reason to hate the bishop, it seemed, once Halford started asking. A maid whose brother had been denied burial for impurity. A curate demoted after preaching a softer gospel. A widow who had once been told she was beyond redemption. All whispered, none admitted. But that wasn't what troubled Father Brown. He didn't care for the obvious. What troubled him was the candle. It should have burned out by 2 a.m., but it hadn't, which meant someone had lit it again, or stayed to watch it burn. That, he said quietly to Halford, was the detail worth dying for. The chapel was sealed off. No one allowed in. But Father Brown asked for 1 hour alone inside, and surprisingly, the inspector agreed. No one knew what he did in that hour, but when he came out, he was pale, not frightened, but pale, and he said only this: "The person who did this didn't mean to kill him. Not really, but they did something far worse." It wasn't long after that the sacristan was found, or what was left of him, hanging in the bell tower, hands bound behind his back, but no sign of struggle. And at his feet, a letter, addressed, chillingly, to Father Brown. It read, "I told you I couldn't keep it buried. You forgave me once. Can you do it again?" And then came the twist no one could reconcile. Father Brown read the letter aloud in the parish hall, in front of Halford, the priests, the grieving flock, and then folded it neatly, pocketed it, and said, "This was not a suicide. This was a silence kept too long. And now the real question begins. Who did he confess for? It wasn't just a murder anymore. It wasn't just one death or two. It was the unraveling of something deeper, older, a sin shared, a pact. One confession had triggered another, and another still. And in the weeks prior, Father Brown recalled, 3 people had come to him, separately, quietly, all weeping, all shaking, none saying the same thing, but all mentioning one name, Ambrose. But what were they confessing? Was it blackmail, a hidden child, a past betrayal, a war crime buried under a changed name? No one could say, and Father Brown wouldn't. He simply returned to the chapel, lit a candle, not in mourning, but in warning. That Sunday, no sermon was given. Instead, Father Brown placed the bishop's rosary on the altar. When asked why, he said, "Because it no longer belongs to a man. It belongs to the truth, and truth is the only thing more patient than God." The villagers waited for an arrest, but none came. Whispers began that perhaps the bishop had deserved it, that perhaps the sacristan was a scapegoat, that maybe, just maybe, the killer was still among them. And then the most damning moment of all. Late one evening, as the moon cut across the stained glass like a blade, Father Brown walked to the garden. Halford followed, and there, under the yew tree, was a small bundle wrapped in linen. Inside, a baby's rosary. Tiny, silver, rusted at the edges. "Someone tried to forget," Father Brown whispered, "but sin has a scent, and this one never left." Halford asked him then, "Do you know who did it?" Father Brown smiled faintly, almost sadly. "Yes." "Will you tell the police?" "No." "Why not?" And Father Brown said something that chilled the bones of everyone who heard it, something that made even the bravest among them step back. "Because once, many years ago, I forgave that sin, and to speak now would be to commit another." And just like that, he walked back into the chapel, leaving Halford holding the rosary, the bishop's sins, and the burden of justice. The case was never solved. The file still rests in the corner of Halford's desk, marked in red. Unresolved. Clerical interference suspected. But if you ask the villagers, they'll say the truth was known, just not spoken. Some say Father Brown made a trade with God that day, one life for another, one secret for peace. Others say he buried the truth beneath the chapel stones, where only the faithful could hear it. But no one denies that he knew. He always knows. And sometimes, forgiveness is the most terrifying verdict of all.